Welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm afraid there's no Joe again, so I'm sorry about that. But you do get Alex and I once more, sounding indistinguishable from one another. And today we were talking FPL, and we were joined by Mark McGettigan, who's better known as FPL General on Twitter. Mark is one of the leading fantasy football players in the country. He actually does it full time. And he's come on the pod to tell us a little bit about what that entails and the processes that he goes through and how he earns his living. And he also gives us a few tips. He gives Alex more than a few tips right at the end about his fancy Premier League selection. Firstly, though, let's talk about The Athletic. Alex, I've been reading Dermot Corrigan's coverage of the Leo Messi situation. It's day by day. It's evolving pretty quickly and it's getting more frenetic with each passing day. What else have you been enjoying on The Athletic at the moment?
I'm going to actually plug something I've done, which is a piece on 5 WSL players that you should watch next season, which was really interesting because obviously the WSL has been incredibly active in terms of transfers and loan signings, with some really, really big names coming in, people like Pernille Harder and Rose Lavelle, Sam Mewis. So I've had a look at some of the other players who were already there last season who might be making a big impact coming up, including one of my favourites, who is Leah Williamson. So that's something that I would like you to look out for.
Now, if someone did want to go and find that and they wanted to get a whopping big discount on their way to doing so, where might they go for that?
They would go to theathletic.com/Tifo transfers. Yes.
They would indeed, and that's 40% off. Also, this season we've got a Tifo Football FPL League, and we've got a little code if you want to sign up and take on Alex and me. We'll try and get Joe involved. Try and get Craig involved, one of the designers. Craig doesn't have a smartphone though, so we don't. That might be pushing our luck a little bit, but give it a go. So to sign up, just enter the code HU2Z6P. And come join our league ahead of Saturday's kickoff. Okay, right, on to Mark. Mark, welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on. So we've talked before, so full disclosure, if you get bored by any of my questions, or if the listeners hear you sounding a little bit bored, the fault for that is entirely mine, because we did this over a Zoom call about a couple of weeks ago, right? I found out all kinds of things about fantasy Premier League that I didn't know before, but we're going to do it again because it was fascinating. This is a kind of natural starting point. You do this full time, and to people like me, can you explain what that entails, how you spend your weeks as a result?
Yeah, so I've been doing it full time now for about 2 years. So I think we talked before about what does a normal week look like for me. A lot of people ask me that question, and it's my wife's a primary school teacher, so I try and work around her. So I try and do a 9 to 5 or a 9 to 4. The start of my week is usually catching up with games from the weekend. So I try to switch off at the weekends, so I'll record the games, I'll watch them at the beginning of the week, and then I'll go looking into all the numbers and record my podcast on a Tuesday. Try to take a day off on a Wednesday as much as possible. I usually fail in that in that goal. And then the later part of the week is kind of getting ready for the weekend then. So it's writing a few articles, interacting then with my subscribers and most importantly, deciding what I'm going to do with my own team for the upcoming game week.
When you say interact with your subscribers, what does that typically involve? What kind of process is that?
Yeah, so for me, it's all about trying to. My goal is to try and help people to become better FPL managers, to make better FPL decisions for themselves. I'll often get people who will come to me and they expect me to spoon feed them. Pick player X, pick player Y. But we always have a conversation then, and I explain that's not what it's about. It's about you learning from my experience and becoming a very good manager in your own right. So it's I do a lot of interaction through. We have a Slack channel which has a big group of subscribers, but then there's more focused one-to-one that we do on WhatsApp, and it's you'll get a lot of people who are very new to fantasy. Maybe they're in their first year or their second year, and it does take quite a while to get your head around everything. So it's just kind of guiding them along the path and trying to help them avoid the pitfalls, and essentially just, I guess, I'm more of a mentor, coach kind of than someone who's going to make decisions for you.
So if I was one of your subscribers, I'm not coming to you for, captain Sadio Mane or drop Kevin De Bruyne. Presumably you're trying to coach me and teach me how to make those decisions and how to be informed about those decisions for myself, presumably.
Exactly. It's kind of trying to guide you along the path. I think what's very important as well when it comes to FPL, there's lots of different kinds of FPL managers, and it will take you probably a good 2 seasons to figure out what kind of manager you are, and that will dictate how you play the game. Do you make early transfers? Do you make late transfers? Do you go for more differentials and stuff like that? So it's trying to feel it out for a season or 2 with people, and then they've got to decide what kind of manager they want to be, and that will kind of dictate their strategy then for the coming seasons.
So, Mark, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Tifo Sensible Transfers series, but it's something that we produce and I write. So I spend a lot of time doing things that sound not dissimilar to what you do, watching lots of football and looking at lots of numbers. And I use those to try and work out who would be sensible signings for teams based on the style of that team's play, but also on which players look like they might be better than the level they're playing at. How well does that approach transition across to being a fantasy Premier League manager? And how much is there a kind of an individual skill that comes with just the format of the game? So understanding that rather than simply understanding data and football.
Yeah, I've listened to a few of those. They've been really good. That's a big thing for me as well. A lot of people listen to Fantasy Premier League podcasts, but I often find that listening to more kind of general football podcasts can be really helpful for people as well. So I do, advise people to check those out before the season starts as well. I think what it all comes down to is, we're all kind of working in the same industry, but when it comes down to it, we're watching games, we're analysing players, we're looking at numbers. So there's always a big, you can link all together. And I just think if you're someone who is, watching a lot of games like we are, if you're looking at lots of stats and numbers as well, that can translate very nicely across to being a very good fantasy manager. You're basically just putting all the knowledge that you've picked up, during your job, and you're kind of applying it then to your decisions from week to week. But yeah, it's very important, I think, to you have to understand how the game works as well, and that does take a while. Simply, especially for new managers, the first thing I always say before doing anything else, go and read the rules, because so many people don't, because it's quite bulky, and there's little things you'll pick up that maybe you didn't realise. And then it's just, like I say, it does take a good probably season or 2 to fully grasp the concept of how the game works, price changes, all that kind of stuff, points hits. So yeah, it definitely does take time.
It's going to be quite embarrassing then when my team is terrible based on what you've just said. So what do you derive from watching games rather than just purely going through the numbers? Because obviously the FPL is a points-based game predicated on certain metrics, obviously things like goals, assists, clean sheets and so on. So what are you looking for when you're actually watching football rather than just looking at numbers? Yeah,
so when it comes to FPL as well, you'll tend to find there's probably 2 camps. There's probably a camp of people who spend more time watching games and make their decisions based on the eye test. On the flip side, you'll have people who rely a lot more on the numbers. And there's, again, people can play the game completely differently. I think we had someone who won FPL 4 or 5 years ago who only watched 2 or 3 games over the course of the season and relied on the numbers because he was just busy with work. When I'm sitting down to watch a game, so I watch all the live games that are on TV in the UK, so probably about 5 a week. Like I say, I do record some of them and then watch them maybe on Monday or Tuesday. When I'm sitting down to watch a game, I'm not really watching it, I'm studying it. I've got a pair of fantasy glasses on, so I'm watching a game very differently to what your everyday fan will, or people who are just working in different areas of football as well. So I'm looking for little things that maybe won't show up in the numbers. Let's say a right back swings a crossing and the striker heads it into the back of the net. But let's say there was another player behind him who possibly would have got on the end of that cross if the striker had missed it. That won't show up in the stats. Things like corners are quite important for me when it comes to the eye test as well. You can, by watching the game, you can see which centre halves are spending their time blocking off to make space for others, Whereas you'll find then which players are actually attacking the ball. So those are the guys you want in fantasy, the guys who are actually going to get goal attempts rather than creating space for others. So it's all those little things that the numbers will tell you so much, but there's definitely something to be had for watching a game as well. And then I just marry it all together. I'll watch a game first, and I will go to the numbers as well, basically to back up what I've seen, or maybe to pick holes in my own eye test, because sometimes your eyes will tell you what you want to see in terms of certain players.
Mark, I want to go back to the subscriber thing just quickly, because internet culture. So if you put something out publicly, and particularly when it's about football, and you're proven wrong, and that can be with an article, with a podcast, with just a social media prediction, the internet loves to tell you you're wrong. For you, when you're interacting with lots of subscribers, and when you've got lots of people, almost an ecosystem feeding off your own knowledge and your expertise and your experience of the game, what's it like when you have a bad week versus, well, not versus, but what's it like when you have a bad week and those around you, the guy that's triple captain Sergio Aguero, for instance, what's it like to be on the receiving end of that mentally?
Yeah, that's the beauty of being a big personality on social media. You've got to take a lot of flack when things don't go your way. I think that's what I've noticed as well. I've got quite a big FPL Twitter account now, and if I do something that may be slightly off the cuff compared to other people, and if it goes wrong, when you log into your Twitter, there's going to be a lot of comments there for you to read through, and you just have to hit that mute button as often as possible. But yeah, it's very. I think this goes for any fantasy manager, though. I think one of the most important things to be a successful fantasy manager is how you deal with those bad game weeks, because we all have them. Even the people who win FPL, season upon season, they'll always have 3 or 4 bad game weeks during a season. But it's very important how you deal with that. It's about focusing on the decision making process. On a Friday, you've got to rewind it back and analyse your decisions before the game week happened rather than afterwards, because we can all captain Aubameyang and he can go and miss a penalty on a Saturday. That doesn't mean it was a bad captaincy decision, whereas some people will beat themselves up about that. But you've got to be disciplined and think back to the Friday when you were making your decision before you knew anything that was actually a logical captaincy decision. But yeah, it's definitely something I've learned to be better with over the last couple of seasons. I actually had to train myself to deal with the negativity better, whether it be just basically having a bad game week myself, or the flack that comes with being on social media nowadays. But you've got to be make a laugh out of it. If I score 24 points in a game week, which is an absolutely dreadful score, you won't see me disappearing off Twitter like you'll see a lot of other people. If that happens to them, you'll see me laughing and joking about unlocking achievement badges and stuff like that. But yeah, it's very important. It's very important how to deal well with a bad game. You can step away for a couple of days and come back fresh, rather than ripping up your team on a Monday or Tuesday and taking -4s and -8s.
I used to play Football Manager in a sort of public way with Ian McIntosh and the set pieces. So I first of all, I did a write-up on Bristol City, which was a very successful series the set pieces put out, and then we expanded that and did a Rangers versus Celtic thing, which was live streamed, which was a horrendous experience from start to finish. Given that there is I understand what you mean in terms of things going badly. I ended up getting sacked from Rangers because their squad was terrible. I maintain it was for those reasons. It's a bit weird doing something that people treat as a hobby, but doing it professionally and doing it publicly. And I found it quite an odd thing to have to navigate, in the fact that I was taking it seriously because I was doing it professionally and I was doing it for an audience. But deep down in my mind, I knew that it was what people do to relax, and it's not the real world and so on. How do you straddle that? Because, you are doing it professionally and you are doing it for an audience. And like you say, if you have a bad week, you have to step away from it. And I completely understand all of that. But there is still that slight oddity that it's not real football. You're not managing an actual team, or how do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's the kind of thing you don't ever want to tell a real hardcore fantasy manager that it's not real football, because it basically takes over our lives, and we treat it like we are real football managers. And it's interesting you mentioned your own experience of playing Football Manager there as well, because that's really where it all started for me as well. I've always played Championship Managers games, since I was 12, 13 years old. Even during the first few weeks of lockdown a couple of months ago, I fired up an old Championship Manager 9900 game, and all those feelings came rushing back from 20 years ago. But yeah, in terms of playing a fantasy game professionally, and I know it's, when I sit back and just listen to what's coming out of my mouth, it does sound a bit strange. It's probably, I can justify it now because it's, at the end of the day, it's paying the bills for me at the end of the week. But like you say, 99.9% of people who play fantasy, it is a hobby for them, and it's it's their release on a Saturday afternoon, forgetting about their week's work or whatever it is. But for me, it is. I think it really does bring its own challenges for people like myself who are content creators, because going back to that thing, if I have a bad game week, I can't just decide on a Tuesday, you know what, I'm not going to record my podcast this week, or I'm not going to write my article. You've got to take the good with the bad, and I've got to turn up week after week, no matter what happens. I suppose the good thing you mentioned, your Football Manager there as well, and getting sacked. That's one of the beauties of being a fantasy manager. No matter how bad you do, you can never get sacked.
But the thing, yes, that is obviously a huge benefit, and you don't get hounded by the questions in the press and so like you do in Football Manager. But how odd is it to do some? I mean, I assume when you started playing fantasy, you started it for the same reasons that most people do it, which is that it's a nice way to stay in touch with football, that it's kind of relaxing, that it's an entertaining way of testing your knowledge. But then at some point you transition, and I wonder, like football, I ended up hating Football Manager when I did that stuff because it became a bit too much. Have you ever felt with FPL almost like you wish you didn't have to show up, that or have you found a way of taking pleasure in it which is different to the pleasure that you took in it when you first started? I've
definitely had my moments, and I've been doing a lot of reflecting over the last couple of weeks as well about how much time I invest in the game, and also how emotionally invested I get in it as well. And I'm going to take some drastic measures next season, just to scale back, less time on Twitter and stuff like that, and switching off at the weekends, doing the match of the day challenge on a Saturday night, rather than sitting, checking the scores every 5 minutes between 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock on a Saturday. My main issue is, I spend Monday to Friday talking about FPL. So when it comes to the games kicking off on a Saturday, quite often, I'm pretty drained, and I sometimes I just want to switch off from it. So that's why I find I record the games most of the time at the weekend, and when I'm feeling a bit fresher, then on a Monday or Tuesday, I'll go back and watch them, because it does become too much. I'd be the first to admit I'm a fantasy football addict. It's on my mind 7 days a week. There's no getting away from it. So it becomes a case of, how do I manage that then? And because I work in FPL, it's very hard for me because I'm so heavily invested. But I've got to try and take a few steps now going into this season to step back a little bit and just be that little bit less engaged, because if I don't, it will result in me having a bad season, because that's what happened 2 seasons ago, which was my first full-time working in an FPL season, and I had my worst ever season in 12 or 13 years, and that was no coincidence. It was just too much, you end up overthinking things too much.
I remember being at a dinner party and someone asked me what I did for work. And I had to try and explain that I basically watched football and then wrote scripts off the back of it to explain how teams played the way they did, and used analytics and stuff like that. And this person genuinely couldn't understand why anybody would pay for that. And I have to say it was slightly tricky to explain it. Do you find yourself in a similar kind of position when, because you're treating it very much like a 9-to-5 job, and it is a 9-to-5 job for you now? Do you find it a difficult thing to explain? Do you find people are kind of incredulous that this is how you now earn a living?
100%. I dread going to dinner parties now, because I know I'm going to get that question of what do you do? I moved into a new house this week. Met a couple of the neighbours just out the front, and you just chit chat. you mention your name, they ask you what you do, and I've probably told, I've probably spoke to 4 neighbours, and I've probably explained it differently 4 times, because I never really, know how to tell people what I actually do. It's usually, are you a football fan? Have you heard of fantasy football? Well, basically I help people around the world to manage their fantasy football teams, and most of the time they just look at you with a funny look, as if is this guy for real? But yeah, it definitely is tricky to explain. But it's also, I'm very, very lucky to do what I do. There's fantasy sports in the UK, it's well behind the US in terms of how big it is. So I could probably count on 2 hands how many people are working full time in fantasy Premier League in the UK. So I'm one of the very lucky ones, and I remind myself of that all the time, that I'm in a very privileged position, and hopefully it can continue for the foreseeable future.
Mark, I'm going to ask you a personal question. You don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but does it ever put a strain on your relationship? You mentioned your wife earlier, and it's like a lot of industries, it has its kind of cycles, its ups and downs. Is it ever tricky for you guys?
It definitely has done in the past, and I've spoken to other people about this as well. It's a good example is that mad period on a Saturday afternoon from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock when you've got maybe 5 or 6 games. That period for a fantasy manager, it's a roller coaster. There's a lot of ups and downs. And if it doesn't go your way, come 5 o'clock, if you're on social media and you're looking at everyone who scored 60 or 70 points, and if you're sitting there with 35 points, it gets you down. But again, you've got to try and nip it in the bud and remember that's the moment where you have to remind yourself this is a game, and if this starts to affect my personal relationships or my mood around the house, you've got to act and you've got to step back. So I will admit, maybe going back 3-4 years ago, I would have let it affect me way too much, and I would have been maybe moody for an hour or 2 after that period on a Saturday. But now I'm much better, and I think it's a lot easier for me now when it's become a job. I'm much more laid back about the game as well, just being more experienced, because I learned as well, if you're someone who does take it too serious and you do let it affect your mood and stuff, you'll make bad decisions. You've got to have a clear head to be a good fantasy manager. So yeah, I've kind of had to train myself to deal with that kind of stuff, and that's why I enjoy doing the match of the day challenge as much as possible on a Saturday. So switch my phone off on a Saturday morning, avoid all the games, go out with my wife, have a nice day, whatever we're up to, and then just crack open a beer at 10:30, not knowing what's happened during the day in terms of fantasy.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it's the bit of the, I suppose, a bit of the job description that no one ever considers, the kind of the mental aspect of it. We will take a very, very short break, and then we're going to come back and talk about Mark's processes and how he picks teams. Okay, Mark, so this is the time of the year when people all over the country are looking at blank screens with 15 blank spots and £100 million to spend on filling them. What's the very first thing that you do every year?
Yeah, that's the most beautiful sight you'll ever see in any calendar year, is when that website opens and you haven't picked any players yet, but you've got your 100 million to spend. You've got your blank canvas. No matter what happened to you last season, you're back at the same rank as everyone else in Gameweek One. So first thing I do will be, usually I'll just auto pick so I can get in quickly. I want to, first of all, before I pick any players, I want to see the prices. So I'll probably go through all 20 teams, quite slowly, looking at, which players have changed price, which players have changed position. And then once I've kind of assessed the prices, then I'll maybe start building a team. And I probably begin with the premium players. So, which 2 or 3 10 million plus players am I going to have? And then, I'm going to probably look at players I think are good value in certain positions. And then it's a matter of just filling in the gaps in your last 3 or 4 positions. But this season was quite different because we had the game launched before we had fixtures, which has never happened before. But it was good because you got to assess every single team and every single player, based on pure merit without fixtures influencing any of your thoughts. So that was very interesting. But yeah, that's basically how I start in the first couple of weeks.
Do you have any golden rules that you observe year in, year out?
Yeah, there's probably a few in terms of my style of play. So I'm very, very patient. You will very rarely see me make a transfer that is not on a Friday night or a Saturday morning. I'm a manager who just likes to have all the available information before making a decision, even if that means I have a lower team value than other managers who are more aggressive. I avoid point sets as much as possible, so I never like giving up, it's hard enough to get points in fantasy, so I don't like giving away 4 or 8 or 12, as some people will go that far. I'm very reluctant to take hits, and the way I avoid them is just to manage my squad efficiently throughout the season. So I'm always focusing on my weak links, not ignoring, small fires. I think last season I only took 4 points hits, which would be a total of minus 16, which is very, very small.
Just to clarify for people that don't play the official game, a points hit is, am I right in thinking, it's when you go over your allotted number of free transfers for the sake of importing, a different player in above your allowed amount. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. So you get 1 free transfer every week, which doesn't cost you anything. Anything more you do will cost you a minus 4 points hit.
One of the other things I've always wondered about, are you one of those people that, obviously, depending on how a player performs throughout a year, his value rises and falls. Is there a kind of a little bit of a cottage industry in the game of people that try and trade in that sort of weird little micro way to make sure that at the beginning of the season they're identifying players who they think will rise in value, and then maybe 3 months down the line they're trading them away to kind of essentially make a profit on them? Is that something? Because it was something I was wondering about when I was picking my own team last week.
Yeah, it definitely is. There's a lot of people who will effectively play a game within the game. So they will play the market. So the idea there would be, especially in the first maybe 4 to 8 game weeks of the season, that's when we get the most volatility in the market. You've got a lot of active managers driving prices up and driving prices down. So you'll get a lot of managers who will make their transfers based on what is happening in the transfer market. If a player, for example, scores a brace on a Saturday, he will rise in price most likely that night and possibly again before the following weekend. So you'll have managers who will buy that player, even if they're not overly keen on him. Maybe even if he doesn't have great fixtures coming up, but they know they're going to make a few bob on him. And what that does, if you fast forward then to the second half of the season, if you compare someone like me who's very patient and doesn't play the market with someone who's very aggressive and does make early transfers, for example, if we're playing our second wildcard, let's say in around game week 30, I might have 103 million to spend, whereas they might have 107, 108. So it does make a difference in the long term. And again, some people like to do it, some people don't. It just depends on the style of manager you are.
We've got a video coming out tomorrow on the channel, which Mark was hugely useful in putting together, in which we talked about one of the themes is the differences between a conservative and an aggressive player. Can you characterize a few more of those? Like, what are the traits of an aggressive fancy football player?
Yeah, so if I think of an aggressive manager, they're probably someone who looks at things like ownership percentage more so than I do. I try to ignore ownership as much as possible because I don't want it to influence my thoughts. I don't want to buy a player just because 60% of the game have that player. I don't want to be afraid of that. I'd rather just pick the player based on how many points I think he's going to get over the coming weeks. A more aggressive manager will probably play the game and look for those opportunities of a player. Let's say people like Anthony Martial and Heung-min Son would be good examples over the last couple of seasons, where they're very explosive players, but they're not very reliable long term. It's very hard to pinpoint when they're going to get their big scores, and for that reason, they're often owned maybe only by 5 to 10% of the game. So the more aggressive managers will be more willing to maybe get those guys in and maybe give them the armband, whereas most people won't even consider bringing them in because they prefer the kind of steady Eddie guys to kind of perform 5 to 6 points over 38 game weeks rather than 15 to 15 over the course of 5 weeks. So yeah, that's another thing that those aggressive guys would do.
Yeah, because one of the things we were talking about was Magnus Carlsen's brief time at the top of the FPL leaderboard, and I dug into some of the discussion around his picks, and he, at some point, I forget the date, it's on the video and I'll be out tomorrow if you're listening on Tuesday. There was a point in the season where he traded away a very informed Mohamed Salah and replaced him for Son Heung-min, who had just played in a Tottenham side that had lost at Leicester, and it's something like a sort of a 50 entry Reddit page. It's extraordinary the amount of reaction that kind of thing generates. Is that another difficult thing? Presumably you must have, you've got a very large Twitter account, you get a lot of subscribers, you're very visible. When you make changes in your team and they're visible, do you have to put up with that kind of thing? Sort of, look what FPL General's doing this week. He's brought in Lewis Cook and etc. Is that Is that strange to kind of? I suppose it's. Do you remember? Do you remember that scene in Casino when they're talking about Ace Rothstein right at the beginning, and how when he's betting on, I think he's betting on American football games, and he sort of the people that he associates with sort of see him as being so influential that when he places the bet, it actually moves the line, the betting line. Is this? There must be a kind of an FPL equivalent when someone like you does something, and all of a sudden, 10,000 people copy you. Does that happen? Is that quite strange when it does as well?
It can happen, and it probably doesn't happen as much anymore because I got to the point where I stopped sharing my team on Twitter, at least before the deadline, because my issue there is if I've got over 100,000 Twitter followers, and if I post my team before the deadline every week, you're going to have a percentage of those people who will just do the exact same thing. They'll make the same transfers as you, and they will pick the same captain. So to avoid that, I've just stopped doing it. But I do remember in the early days, it would happen, and I see it with other large accounts who do share their team before the deadline, and they make it visible. And it does create a bandwagon effect, and I even see it myself. It's echo chambers. So Twitter's an echo chamber. I've got a small Slack channel with maybe 200 or 300 people. But even if I share my team in there before the deadline, a lot of people will row in behind me and get the same player. As much as you wouldn't like people to follow you as much, I think that's human beings. It's a natural thing to do. If someone's a successful manager and you see what he's doing, a lot of them are inclined to follow. I guess it's probably they feel safer doing that than making their own choices.
Yeah, that'd be really frustrating. Anyway, I bet people didn't think I could get Casino into this podcast. We're going to have another little break. Afterwards, Alex is going to reveal his fantasy Premier League team. And Mark's going to rip it apart. And we're going to have a good old giggle about that. Okay, Alex, moment of truth. Full disclosure, you are not an habitual fantasy Premier League player. You, I don't think, have ever played FPL. And you took some persuading to do this. So... with your asterisks and caveats, can we have your team? And Mark, please be absolutely brutal. Be absolutely savage with him on behalf of all the listeners, please.
Don't worry, I will be.
Okay. So in goal, I have my starting goalkeeper. I've gone for Bernd Leno, and my backup goalkeeper is Alex McCarthy. My reasons for this are looking at post-shot XG plus or minus per 90 for last season.
Here we go.
Yeah, here we go. Don't worry, some of them are way more gut than that.
Okay.
They both perform pretty well. I have, as listeners will know from the last podcast, got a good feeling about Southampton's defensive unit this season, which is why I quite like McCarthy. Leno, I think there's confidence in him because despite how well Emi Martinez played towards the end of last season, Arsenal are apparently offering him about, which means that Leno will be the starting goalkeeper, and that's obviously something that Arteta is basing on performance. I also think Arsenal's defensive structure will be more solid with William Saliba coming in, and so I have good confidence in both of my goalkeepers. Mark's now going to tell me why that is misplaced.
I can't really fault you, unfortunately, in this position. What I would say is McCarthy's very popular going into the new season. Southampton have got a good start, so I'd like him at 4.5 million. But my criticism here would be you've probably spent too much on two goalkeepers. You probably don't need two goalkeepers. So I would probably back McCarthy there at 4.5. If you replace Leno with a 4 million non-playing goalkeeper, then you've got £1 million extra for the rest of your squad.
Alex has made unsensible transfers then, to be fair, with his goalkeeper.
Shocking.
Right, off
Absolutely
you go.
Shocking.
Let's have the back four, please.
Right, so the back four, well, actually, it's a
five, isn't it?
It's a back five currently because, it's a starting back five because the two Manchester teams don't have fixtures in the first game week, but we'll come to that in due course. So I've gone for Bednarak and Salisu from Southampton for very similar reasons to McCarthy. I I think Salisu has the opportunity to score goals. I think with Ward-Prowse's set-piece delivery, Southampton could be good from corners. Bednarak seemed like quite a high scorer for quite a low cost, and will probably get the nod over Stevens, I would suggest. John Joe Kenny from Everton I've picked on the basis that he was probably the only good player that Schalke had last season. I can see him coming into that Everton side and doing well. He also didn't cost very much. And then I've gone for two absolute defaults, Trent Alexander-Arnold and Andy Robertson, on the basis that I had quite a lot of money, and Klopp's Liverpool are not going to change their style particularly. They've not yet recruited a midfielder that means the creativity is going to come centrally. They're still going to use the fullbacks for that a lot, and they seem like pretty consistent bankers for lots and lots of points that can remain so throughout the season.
Mark, all yours. Although I will say, Alex,
did you name 4 defenders or 5 there?
He went 5. I love the kind of, I had a lot of money. I bought Alexander-Arnold and Robertson. Where did he go wrong, Mark?
So Bednarak, Salisu, Kenny, TAA. Who was the 5th one?
Robertson.
Right, perfect. Right, Robertson and TAA are perfect. I can't fault those. Both of those are in my latest draft and most likely to stay there. But this is the part where I do get to rip your team apart already.
Thank you.
If you sent me a picture of this draft without even seeing the midfielders or the forwards, my first question to you would be, are you a Southampton fan? Because having 3 of them is to me is overkill.
I mean, yes, I am.
The problem, I think, and you mentioned it yourself as well, I think one of the golden rules in FPL for me is, especially in the first game week, you've got to pick players that are 100% going to play. Do we know Bednarak and Salisu are going to start the first game? There's probably some question marks there. There's probably 3 players there looking at 2 spots. You mentioned Stevens as well. John Joe Kenny, you could probably say the same. Seamus Coleman is still kicking about there. Will Kenny come in from the start? We can't say that is 100% either. So I like TAA and Robertson, but I don't like the other 3 at all.
At all, gosh.
Also, your fantasy football week is kind of ruined if Southampton ever concede a goal, Alex, which is a really bold position, I feel.
Sure. I have a lot of confidence in Ralph Hasenhüttl's chaotic counter-press.
Okay, just making sure we're on the same page.
What can I say?
Okay, into midfield we go.
Try and redeem yourself now.
So, midfield, that's 5 of them as well. Again, I've gone for 2 bankers in Kevin De Bruyne and Riyad Mahrez. Now, obviously, there's a problem there because in the first game week, City aren't playing, but I assume we'll catch up at some point. De Bruyne and Mahrez, again, I think De Bruyne is a default. Mahrez, I can see, particularly with the departure of Leroy Sané, Mahrez getting lots and lots of game time. Statistically, they're both outstanding players. I can't see a good reason not to have both of them. I've gone for Dwight McNeil because I really like him. I think that Burnley are shifting to a more attacking style of play. He was surprisingly inexpensive. And given the way he plays and the strikers that Burnley have, I can see him getting quite a few assists, possibly even getting forward and scoring a bit. Then my other 2 picks. So I've gone for Eberechi Eze, which obviously is a conflict of interest because their first game is at Southampton. But I just have a good feeling about him coming into the Premier League. I think Palace will be using him a lot to attack. He's obviously, he's a relatively big money signing for them, even though he's actually, I think, quite good value in real terms. And I can see them becoming slightly more attacking with him on board, taking some of the weight off Zaha. And my last choice is Kevin McAllister of Brighton. Now, he was very, very cheap and barely played last season.
Do you mean Alexis McAllister?
Sorry, I mean Alexis McAllister.
Kevin McAllister's from Home Alone, Alex.
No, Kevin McAllister is Alexis McAllister's brother who plays as a defender in Argentina.
No, he's in Home Alone.
No, there is no.
I know. Sorry, okay. Alexis McAllister, spelt strangely. It's got a little gap in between the Mac and the Alistair, which I always find
it has indeed.
But yeah,
yeah. Now the reason I've picked him is that I know Brighton made a significant effort to get him recalled from the loan that he was on. They obviously really like him. I think that that team is going to have a slightly younger feel to it this season, possibly with Ben White coming in as well on a big contract. I can see McAllister being a good attacking midfield option at Brighton in a nicely well coached side under Potter. So he's kind of a gamble, yes, and he won't get any points in the first week, but as a sort of fill-in for not an awful lot of money, he's someone that I quite like.
I'm going to try and be as nice as possible here.
You're definitely
a first-time fantasy manager with some of these picks, because I mean, last couple of weeks on Twitter, I've seen hundreds of teams. I don't think I've seen McAllister or McNeil in any of them. But that's not to say maybe you're the guy with the knowledge that we need to be listening to. I'll start with the Man City guys. It is a bit of a headache this season that they don't play in the first game. I think it's probably better to have, if you're going to have a Manchester United or a Manchester City midfielder, it's probably best to have just one in the first week to get 0 points, because you're going to be struggling to field 11 players if you have two of them. You could always start with one. Let's say you have KDB on your bench and then work Mahrez in later. So I probably would take out one of those guys. McNeil, I never feel great about Burnley attackers when it comes to FPL. They've always been great value, the goalkeeper and their defenders. Chris Wood has been quite good as well. But again, McNeil is a very good player, but that doesn't always translate into FPL points. The easy guy at Crystal Palace, he could be very interesting. I think he's come in at 6 million. I think it's good to have one or two punts in your team at the start. I think he's probably perfect for that. He's an unknown quantity in the Premier League. Not many people will have him, and if he hits the ground running, you'll be laughing. So he's probably the only. But him and KDB are probably the only two that I would keep there.
Before we get to Alex's forward line, Mark, do you have a favourite punt from your own FPL history?
Punt, yeah, probably my favourite ever. I think I've talked to you before about Theo Walcott on the final day, but another one has just come to mind here, and it's more for this time of the season. I remember when Amr Zaki joined Wigan.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
This was before I was a serious fantasy manager. It was probably one of my first seasons. I remember having him for the first couple of weeks, and I definitely captained him either the first week or the second week when he scored a hat-trick. I think he scored 9 or 10 goals in the first maybe 10 games and didn't score for a long time after that. But
ever again, possibly.
Exactly. he probably still hasn't scored since.
Probably not, no.
But he was one of my favourite ever Gameweek One picks.
Were you, when you made that pick, I know you weren't doing what you are now, but were you approaching it from a kind of a more professional perspective, or were you just still playing as I would?
Yeah, I was more of a casual fan back then, playing against mates in mini leagues. But I very clearly remember looking up his stats from his previous clubs. I think he was at Zamalek.
Yes,
it stands out. And I remember his goal record was insane, and that's what I went off.
If the name Amr Zaki doesn't ring a bell with you, have a look at his goal at Anfield for Wigan. Absolutely absurd scissor volley. Wonderful.
Got me 4 points for that.
Is that the way you? When you think back on seasons past, Mark, is that how you bookmark the events of the game, or more so than with the kind of the more anecdotal things like a great goal? Is it the kind of that was a 56 point weekend for me?
Yeah, do you know what it is? One of my favourite shows is Premier League Years, and I always go back and watch some of them during the off season. So I've been doing it recently. And what I find is, I was watching one the other day, and it was Dimitri Payet, and he banged in a free kick, and I just say, I remember he got me 12 points that week. That's kind of the way I remember games now.
Yeah, that must be really strange. Alex, your forwards, please.
Yes. Okay. So I have got.
This is your only hope.
Chipped away at his confidence.
You're so cruel.
He will never play again, Mark. This is our one chance to bring him into the
it's fine because I've got unlimited transfers until whenever I've got them until.
Exactly.
And
now's
so
the time to get
he's going to be up until 6 o'clock tomorrow morning doing
so
this.
Now's getting ripped apart. Very, very helpful.
Yeah.
Because afterwards, Mark's going to tell me what I should be doing better. Right, front line. I've got Dominic Calvert-Lewin. Because I think the James Rodriguez move is going to happen. I can see Calvert-Lewin, who's a player I really, really like anyway, scoring quite a few goals this season with greater creativity and a bit more of a pattern behind him. Roberto Firmino, partly so I can keep practicing how to pronounce his name because I always get it wrong. He just, he seems like a pretty decent banker. He did well last season. He's going to start. He's going to play lots of games. And then Raul Jimenez, who I think is probably the best striker outside of the big six clubs. Very much the focal point for Wolves' attack. Gets assists as well as goals. And yeah, just seems like a sensible choice.
Finally got a decent part of your squad, so you've saved yourself with the strikers. Jimenez is one of my favourite FPL players. I've had him, the best part of the last 2 years, and he's just so consistent. Very good chance he will be in my Gameweek One squad. Calvert-Lewin's an interesting one as well because I think he's getting overlooked by a lot of people from what I'm seeing on social media. People think back to the post-lockdown period where he didn't score much. But I think it's very important. You've got to draw a clean slate in a new season. Give the guy a fresh chance. And like you say, those signings that are coming in, that should help the Everton strikers. Now, Firmino's an interesting one because you said he did well last season. Now, as a fantasy manager, I would say he didn't do well last season. So that's where you get your football fan opinion and you get your fantasy manager opinion, because as a fantasy asset he was very unreliable. I think he only scored 1 goal at Anfield. Was that the final week of the season?
Yeah.
So he was very unreliable in terms of fantasy points, and the likes of Mane, Salah and the Liverpool defenders were much more reliable. So Firmino's another player. His ownership will be extremely low in Gameweek One because of that. He's not really a favourite of FPL managers. A lot of people think he's too expensive, me included. So that's an interesting one. Again, on the flip side, if he starts the season really well, you're going to fly because very few people are going to have him.
Mark, between now and we're 4 days away from the start of the season, and if it was in the middle of the season, you'd obviously be studying game footage. What are you doing between now and kickoff to refine your team, to make any last minute decisions? What kind of processes are you going through?
To be honest, I'm doing very little, and that's what I've been trying to tell people as well. A lot of my subscribers and people on Twitter, they're very eager, 2-3 weeks, a month even before the season starts. They're on the FPL website every day. They're chopping and changing, unlimited transfers, and by the time Game Week 1 comes, they've had every single player in their team at some point, and then they're inevitably frustrated when that player scores a hat-trick in the first weekend and they don't have him. So I think it's very important until maybe 2 or 3 days before kickoff, where we are now. That's when you really start to knuckle down. So previously I wouldn't have been doing very much. I tend to ignore the pre-season friendlies almost completely. Take them with a pinch of salt. When it comes to picking my Game Week 1 team this weekend, it's all about tried and trusted FPL players from previous seasons. Teams with good fixtures. I give new players to the league and stuff like that, and then promoted teams time to settle in before investing in any of their players.
And last question, because we've taken up far too much of your evening already. What was the? Do you remember the first season when you played Fantasy?
It's very hard to pinpoint it.
I'll make it easier for you. Did you play by mail, or had the internet started? That's aged me quite considerably.
My first ever fantasy memory, and this only came back to me recently when I really sat down to think about it. The last time my beloved Republic of Ireland were in the World Cup was 2002. I was 11 years old. And my uncles have a bar back in Ireland, and they ran basically it was a fantasy competition. You had to pick. You had 100 million. You had A4 sheets of players, and you had to pick 5 midfielders and 5 forwards from the World Cup tournament. And the only 2 players I remember having are, I think it was Michael Ballack and Rocky Santa Cruz. And I remember waking up at 6 a.m. to watch Paraguay. Just because Rocky Santa Cruz was on, I had picked him in that game. So yeah, that was my first memory as an 11-year-old 2002 World Cup.
What's always struck me as quite strange is that, my early memories go back a bit further in that I remember you used to have to, for certain games, you used to have to get the pull-out from the paper. And I'd ask my mum to do it, to bring back, it was from like the Times or the Telegraph or whatever paper she could find at work. And then you'd actually have to, you get a big sheet of, you get a big list of paper players, each with their own individual code, and you'd have to enter them and then mail your form in. And the game's popularity was strange because for most people that was the last you ever saw of your team, because you couldn't log in to any kind of system and check on your points tally. You could make transfers, but the process was incredibly convoluted. And yes, they would occasionally publish like a top 100 managers in the country in the paper, but you sort of got disenfranchised from your team until the next season came around. And and also don't forget, like, unless you photocopied your form, you kind of forgot who was in your team as well. by about November, you couldn't even remember sort of half of your players. You'd always pick sort of Andy Hinchcliffe and Matt Letizia, but apart from that, there wasn't really a way of tracking it. So it's interesting to find so many people, I'm 36 now, so many people of my age whose interest has sort of has survived those years. But for you, Mark, what do you think is the next evolution to the game? What do you think if we're sitting having this conversation in maybe 10 or 20 years time, goodness, if we're still working for Tifo in 20 years time, Alex, what will be different about it?
What I would love to see happen with fantasy in the UK, next 5, 10 to 20 years is, you switch on the television at the weekend, and they're not just analysing the game from a football perspective. You have proper fantasy football programs like you have in the US, for the various sports over there. You've got fantasy analysts on match of the day, giving their opinion from a fantasy perspective as well. And for someone like me who's working in this industry, that's my big hope that does happen. And I wouldn't be surprised if it did. I think fantasy is only going to go in one direction. In terms of the game itself, again, I think it's very hard to predict how it's going to change, because if you think back to, like you say, printing things out, pulling things out of a newspaper and send them off in the post, and how far we've come in a relatively short space of time. Who knows what it's going to be like in the future?
So I've just got one last question, Mark, and be as circumspect as you like. I'm obviously going to go away and pull this team apart now, dropping Leno, dropping Mahrez, dropping. I'm not dropping McNeil, mate. Whatever happens, I'm sticking with McNeil. If you were to give me one tip to go away and redraw this team with, what would that tip be?
Do you want a kind of a strategy tip, or more in terms of individual player tips?
A strategy tip.
Yeah, what I would say is I would probably distribute your cash differently from what you've got there. So I would probably put a lot more cash into midfield. I think there's lots of big options, the likes of your Salahs, your Aubameyangs, your Bruno Fernandes. Obviously, he doesn't play the first game week, but I would probably pump a lot more cash into midfield, maybe a little bit less up front. And again, I think defensively you're okay in terms of how much you've spent there. Take the $1 million away from Leno and put that into midfield. So I think that's the main thing in terms of structure.
I shall send you what I've done.
You won't be able to get rid of him now, Mark. He's yours for the season. He'll be
No. Just the one thing. Then we'll see how it goes.
Mark, you thank you very, very much for coming on. You do a weekly column for The Athletic, and where can we find that other than obviously on The Athletic. What day of the week does that publish?
Usually towards the end of a week, usually on a Thursday or a Friday. There will be quite a few before the season kicks off. You can get my 59th minute podcast is available on The Athletic as well. There's a few of those already available for pre-season.
And on Twitter, you're at FPL General, right?
Yeah, that's the best place to find me. That's where I spend the majority of my time.
Right, so stop following me and Alex for FPL, if you ever did, and get on that. And thank you very, very much, and best of luck for the season, Mark.
Cheers, guys. It was a pleasure. Best of luck, Alex in particular.